for the keynote afternoon speech up here. We've talked a lot about bringing in more capital. We've talked a lot about bringing in more people into the sector. We would like to sort of end the day talking about something that's very important, that brings together a lot of these issues from water, food, and security. And I will pass this off to Seth, who will introduce our speaker. But Seth is somebody who's spoken here before, is a best-selling author in the water space, done many different activities in business and outside of business and public policy. So hopefully this discussion will bring together a lot of the various issues and really begin to get people's minds thinking about water, food, and security. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Seth.
Thank you very much. I hope this has been said several times today already, but I'd like to say a word of thanks to both Alex and to his partner, John Regas. This is year number 5, 6?
Number 5.
Year number 5 of this conference. It grows in importance. It grows in attendance every year. The size of attendance in this particular auditorium is not necessarily reflective of how many people come to this and have been influenced by it and have learned from it. And I just simply think all of us should say thank you to you and to your partner, John, for what you have done to help raise the level of awareness of water issues, whether it's fun games like the one we just had. And of course, I know all 10 of them. I just didn't want to compete, But, or whether it's more substantive stuff from hosting this and having conversations, whether here or out in the hallways. One of the problems about water, I believe, is that it's a much underreported topic. You can hardly go a day without a news story about energy of one kind or another. If you flip through the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, other leading newspapers, you can go quite a number of days without a single mention of water unless it's on the local beat where they're talking about a water main break or something like that. Today, to some extent, we're going to talk about how somebody who's working very hard to change that. To my right is Nate Halverson. He's, if you don't already know who he is, you'll know a lot more about him in the coming weeks and months. He's going to have a much higher profile very soon. He's already won an Emmy Award for he's already won an Emmy Award for his reporting. He's a senior reporter and producer at the Center for Investigative Reporting, based in San Francisco. What you'll be hearing, if you haven't seen it already, how many of you have seen the film The Grab? Any of you, can I say that? Well, I will bet that 60 days from now or 30 days from now, that would be nearly universal here in this audience. I've had a chance to see it already. He's the producer and lead reporter for The Grab. It's a feature-length documentary which followed him and a team of reporters as they uncovered powerful interests vying to control global food and water supplies. We'll be talking about that. It's already for rent on just about everything that you could go on, Apple, Amazon, and so forth. And starting October 10th, I think, right? Starting October 10th, it's going to be streaming on Hulu. So lots of good stuff. As you'll see when you see the movie, but also just to tell you, Nate has reported from basically every corner of the world. Just a couple of the countries he's reported from is Russia, Guatemala, England, Zambia, Congo, China, Venezuela. And he isn't really a water guy, although maybe now we can invite him into the fraternity of water guys after he spent all this time working on this documentary. But he's an investigative reporter who's done all kinds of great investigative things on financial fraud and other important topics. So before we get into talking about, before we jump into the pool and start talking about what you found in your film and what we can learn from this. Oh, I should mention to the audience, we had anticipated a slightly larger panel. Something had happened, one of the panelists couldn't make it. So we decided, since Nate and I had already established that we liked each other so much, that we would turn this from kind of an interview, which should still be more of that than not, but more a bit of a conversation as well. And we'll invite all of you into that conversation too. If people have important things to add or to say, to the extent I can see you, wave your hand, and I'll try to include you or your comment or your thought or your worry into what we're talking about today. Is the amplification okay on this? I'm just making sure. It is, okay, okay. Okay, so before we talk about water, if I can turn slightly this way, tell us how does one become an investigative reporter? Every so often I see in a newspaper article, so-and-so, an investigative journalist who did da. And I'm wondering, what is the career track that gets you there? Did you go through your sister's closet or something? I mean, how does one get to be an investigative reporter?
It's not a particularly glorious story, but the truth is I was an economics undergrad at the University of Minnesota, and we were having a house party in the spring, and in Minnesota, when the temperature reaches like 50, after being negative 20, we all think it's like 100. So everyone's walking around in tank tops and short shorts, and I'm sitting on the front porch of my then undergrad university home, and this brilliant woman is talking, and we're going back and forth, and I'm only 18. So when she tells me that she works at the student newspaper, the Minnesota Daily, in my little addled brain, rather than just asking her out, I thought I had to get a job at the student newspaper, not knowing that it was like the biggest student newspaper in the country. It had like a $7 million operating budget. Kids come from all around to get jobs there. And so I jumped through all of these hoops, and I get a job at the student newspaper, and they onboard me the first day. And at the end of it, I go, okay, cool. Where does Christina sit? And they go, Christina, she quit. And then it was like a week later, and the then governor, Jesse the Body Ventura, had announced that he was slashing funding for the university, and rates were going to go up 10%. And I was asked to write the story, so I thought, well, I guess I should just call the governor's office and get a quote from somebody. And next thing, I'm on the phone with the governor of Minnesota. And I thought, what is going on? I'm some 18-year-old punk kid that just wanted a date, and now I'm on the phone with the governor. And then from there, so bottom line was I never met Christina again, but I totally fell in love with journalism, and specifically, I began to focus on investigative journalism.
But do we know where Christina is today?
No, I never saw her again.
Come on, you're an investigative journalist.
I fell in love with the investigation I should have prioritized love, but instead I prioritized the news.
Could somebody just Google Christina, University of Minnesota, something like that? How many Christinas could there be at the University of Minnesota?
A large school.
It's a large Christina school, I think, right? Okay. So we understand now. And before we, again, one or two more introduce you to the audience. So the first thing you do when you get into the world of investigative journalism is not about water itself. Talk about one or two of the other significant worlds that you have pierced before you started talking about water. Not too long, by the way.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
because we do want to talk about water.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to I'm trying to humanize you for the audience, because clearly you have no rapport with the audience.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, even when I was at the Minnesota Daily, somebody called into the newsroom and said that the university, the foundation, was dumping all of these documents in a dumpster behind that was open, and that there were social security numbers in there. So even as like an 18-year-old, I put on like this hazmat suit, because apparently they were all covered in black fungus, and I went into the dumpster and found the names of the high net worth individuals who were donating to the universities, whose social security and cash checks were all sitting in a dumpster. And I called them up and I said, what do you think about the university dumping your private information in an open dumpster? And it went on from there. And I got very fortunate early in my career to meet a man, Lowell Bergman, who Al Pacino portrayed in The Insider. Lowell was the one who worked to get the documents outside of the tobacco companies to show that, in fact, the executives knew that tobacco was both a carcinogen and addictive, despite testimony to Congress. And then that became The Insider with Al Pacino. Al was a longtime 60 Minutes producer. Lowell was a longtime 60 Minutes producer. And so I had the opportunity to work on some PBS Frontlines. Lowell's a madman. He sent me to Macau, China for 6 weeks to get gangsters to go on camera. Just me, like prepping for him. And so it's been a long history of diving deep into specific things where I think there is a great need for public awareness.
Okay, before we get into the premise of the film, and we're on for a little bit of a late afternoon treat. We're going to show the trailer of The Grab in a minute or so. I assume there's a tech person up there we can do that with? Okay. Before we do that, and before I'm going to ask, the question I'm going to ask you next is going to be to tell us the premise of the film. But before we get to that is, why water? I mean, you're doing all this sexy stuff. Water is a tough area to investigate. Financial fraud is easier. Political corruption is more fun. You get to see them go to jail. Why water? What drew you to water?
The answer is really simple because you're right. I had narrative stories that were so much more compelling as stories, right? Like if we're just talking sheer stories, I have a Chinatown mafia boss that calls me from prison multiple times a week, wants me to tell his story. This is somebody that was managing organized crime across the United States. It's a martial arts expert, organized crime. It's super sexy. I can sell that to a Netflix executive much easier than going in and saying, we want to do a documentary about water, right? But the short answer is this was the most important subject that I knew that I could cover in the world. I don't know that there's going to be any other topic that's going to impact more people around the world than this one right here. So from just a moral obligation, this was the story I needed to tell, even if it was a much more difficult story to tell.
And as the audience will learn from what the film's about, not only more people, but for a longer time horizon. This is dealing basically global systems. Terrific. So why don't we cue the audience in, Albert? Tell us a little bit about actually, from start date to today, when was the first date you said, aha, this is important, I really want to do this?
So I had been asked to look at, for PBS NewsHour, which is PBS's like nightly news show, to look at Shuangwei or WH Group, China's largest meat company's purchase of Smithfield Foods, which was the largest pork company in the world. They effectively own 1 in 4 American pigs. And the Congress was going back and forth as to whether or not this was the Chinese government being involved in a major food company in the United States. And the Senate was having hearings, so I went and I interviewed Senator Stabenow. And then I went to China, and the Chinese were really candid that this was part of the 5-year plan, and I got the documents to support that. And we were just able to show conclusively that the Chinese government was funding the takeover or helping fund the takeover to meet their 5-year goals of securing food and water resources around the world. And, so then the next question after you sort of answered that why is, well, who else is doing that?
And when was this first date? What was this?
2014.
So this is a long cycle of research to get to this.
Yep.
So your overnight success is like most overnight successes. It took more than one night.
Yeah, it did. It goes all the way back to Christina.
Okay. who, by the way, those nice gifts were from Asprey or something like that. Is that who it's from? I saw the boxes. So who were the boxes from?
The gift for the AQ was from Asprey.
Asprey, that's what I meant. Yeah. So if you imagine those 2 nice boxes for getting the trivia questions, if you can get the Christina answer by the end of the speech, Nate's going to take you out for a shopping spree.
You'll be my best person at the wedding.
Okay, so the premise of the film is that the world is the world is finding itself in a new paradigm for how countries, large organizations, communities are sourcing their food, which means in a sense how they're sourcing their water, right? Okay. So that's the premise. Why don't we play the trailer if we could? There we go.
I've covered stuff in the past that people told me I should be concerned about, that I should be watching my back.
I'm just gonna close the door here. All right. We're talking thousands and thousands.
This project has kept me up at night more than all of my other investigative reporting projects combined.
Every century is characterized by a key commodity.
And food is a very obvious and central way to wield power.
I came across this classified cable telling companies to go overseas and buy up food and water resources. And a lot of this is happening in the shadows, quietly.
Food has become much more powerful than oil.
How do you think that's going to end?
It's not just China, not just Russia. This is Wall Street, big money, is leasing land to foreign countries. I thought maybe there might be more to it than that. Turns out there was.
I mean, it's like a who's who. It's like the MVPs of the mercenary world.
What if there's an uprising?
So that's where we come in.
Private military corporations.
One of the most notorious mercenaries on the planet. You have thousands of his emails.
Correct. That there was a piece of paper.
Right there was all of our names and passport numbers. They were definitely waiting for us. This is the part of the story that makes us think that all of our communications are hacked.
You just take and take and take, And pretty soon there isn't anything to take.
When you don't have enough food, money is useless.
While policy experts are debating, whoever has guns is going to go after it and get it.
He said I trust no one but myself right now.
We're getting kicked out.
How I went from food and water to invisibility cloaks. There's no bigger story that will impact more people than this story.
Alex, to do over again, I would ask you to get everybody some popcorn for this showing, but okay, without it. Okay, so now the trailer is obviously a trailer. It starts to suck you in a little bit. It's machine gun fire. The whole movie doesn't have a lot of machine gun fire, a lot of chilling, scary music, although there is a nice shot of you without the beard as a younger version of yourself in the film, which I thought was very cute. Okay, so let's talk about some of the countries that you highlight in the film. You talk about Russia, China, UAE, U.S. farmers, but let's start with Saudi Arabia, since that's sort of where the story starts, right? What did you find about Saudi Arabia, and why did it scare you?
Well, it goes back to after I'd done the Smithfield story, where then I began talking to folks and saying, okay, so if China's worried about securing their future food supplies, what other countries are running into these issues? And the kingdom was one of the places that was pointed out to me. So I began saying, okay, so where is Saudi Arabia going to secure their water, to grow their food, to ship back to the kingdom? And one of the places I found was Arizona, like, Wile E. Coyote desert of Arizona, where, of course, there's fossil aquifers that the Saudi company bought up the land. They have unrestricted use to the aquifers. They pump it up. They grow the hay. They developed a new technology to compact the hay bales quite small because, of course, shipping containers are measured by size and not weight. And they ship them to Long Beach, and then it gets sent back to Riyadh. And the idea in that story isn't necessarily that Saudi Arabia is a bad actor in this situation. The idea on doing that original story that came out in 2015, we did an NPR episode of our show Reveal about it. It was that these things aren't theoretical anymore, right? Saudi Arabia was the world's 6th largest exporter of wheat in the 1990s. It was pumping up so much of its groundwater that it was actually a desert nation was able to do that. But it didn't last, right? Like there are springs that are mentioned in the Bible from 2,000 years ago that have now gone dry because they have drained down those aquifers to such an extent. And so I wanted to be able to illustrate to people that not only is this a reality that is already taking place, but there is now a domino effect and a consequence of that reality, which is that King Abdullah, before he passed, had said to his companies, you need to go, you can't continue to grow alfalfa and wheat here at the same rates. Some of them were, I think for a while, they were all completely banned. And you have to go overseas, and here's subsidies. And so this is what you begin to see then. And it's not necessarily going to water rich communities to do these things. It was going to an environment that it also was going to have the same consequences what had happened in Saudi Arabia. Because the benefit of growing hay in the desert is that you can get maybe 10, 12 cuttings a year, and it dries out incredibly well, right? So then you're not dealing with some of the fungal or other issues at the end of the growing cycle.
Right. So, and I know your reporting took you to Arizona. Let me share with the audience, since this is something that I personally have been devoting a lot of my time to, as Alex mentioned, I've written 2 books about water, first about water scarcity, the second one about drinking water quality. I'm now, the last several years, I've been focused on a technology invented in Israel, which is sort of the world center of water innovation, technological innovation. An invention that takes flood-irrigated land, converts it into drip-irrigated space. Unlike drip irrigation, which is very energy-intensive and requires a lot of field modification that's very expensive, this works exclusively off of on and totally sustainable gravity. It uses only gravity as its energy source. It's relatively cheap to install. There's no ongoing operating expense because there's no utility cost involved with having to propel the water. And it saves half of the water. It increases yields by about 1/3. It cuts fertilizer use by about half, reduces farm labor by about 20% cost. So it's a virtuous circle. So the company decided to center its activities in Arizona. And here's what it took me months of rereading it to believe that it was true. Arizona, which has summer temperatures sometimes of over 120 degrees, lots of sandy soil, so a lot of water percolates into the earth. I should ask Alex to add it to his list for next year, and all of you will have a heads up. 89% of the irrigation done in Arizona with those temperatures, with that soil type, 89% of the irrigation is flood irrigation. Now, it's the same water that is used that comes off of the Colorado River. That's where the water comes from.
In the case of the Saudi farm, it's groundwater. They don't have rights to the Colorado River.
Yeah. It's further off. So, but in the case of the farmers who are using this water, it's extraordinary to think about the fact that Colorado River is running low, Lake Mead is running low, and yet nonetheless we're flood irrigating large parts of the Colorado River basin. It's an extraordinary thing. So, and it turns out that actually the Saudi farm, although it's in the news this week for reasons, a fight between the governor and the attorney general of Arizona, which the question of whether or not they'll renew their license to pump water at all, it is groundwater. The question is whether or not they're actually even such bad actors from a water perspective. If they weren't shipping the hay to Saudi Arabia, would we even be annoyed by what they're doing? Because in fact, they're doing something that most of the alfalfa growers in Arizona aren't doing. They're using pressurized drip. It's expensive. It's energy intensive. They're happy to spend lots of money to grow their hay. I don't know why, but they are. But they are at least a little bit more water conservation minded than otherwise. So is your issue about the Fondamonte farms the fact that it's our water and that it's being shipped to Saudi, the produce is being shipped to Saudi Arabia? Or is it the fact that Arizona as a whole and the groundwater Pinal County and the other groundwater counties are so incredibly reckless with how they use their water? And you have I forget the name of the woman who's
Holly Irwin, the county supervisor, yeah.
Which we'll get to her in a moment. But where is it your divide that upsets you about it? Is it sort of I know you're a good-hearted internationalist, so you're not a xenophobe, that I know for sure. But is it that it's going to Saudi Arabia, or is it that it's reckless use of water, or is it a combination of the two?
Well, first off, I wouldn't use the term bad actor or being upset about it. I mean, for me, it's baseline information, right? Like, I view my role as a journalist to impartially go out and collect information and give it to the public. And oftentimes it's hard to access information, or people don't know about it because it's tied up at the CIA, or it's tied up at the DOD, or maybe it's just because it's happening in a very remote area of La Paz County with Holly Irwin, so people don't know about it. Then what you hope is what's happening now, right? Which is that Carrie Lake, who ran against Katie Hobbs, both of those governors a couple years ago, debated around this issue. So now you have high-profile debates going on around what is appropriate water use. And when I listen to the conversations today, what I hear over and over again from this room is people aren't attuned enough to water, right? And what we're doing is raising the awareness around these issues. So I wouldn't characterize Saudi Arabia as a bad actor, and I wouldn't say I was upset by it. The things that I would push back just on an informational basis from what you laid out was that the Fondamonte farm, which is the Saudi farm, it is drip irrigation. They put that in right away. And this was, when I came out with this story in 2015, this was something that the Arizona Water Commissioner pointed out. They've converted to drip irrigation. And so then I just followed that up. I said, oh, okay, so they're using less water then, right? Because it's drip irrigation. And that ultimately turns out usually not to be the case, right? Because there's the Jevons effect, which is that when it's just a graph, right? You increase efficiency, it doesn't mean that you decrease consumption. Often what economists have found over time is when you increase efficiency, you're actually reducing the cost and you're actually increasing consumption. And so that's why you just have to remember that you can't conflate efficiency necessarily with overall consumption. And this is a fossil aquifer. So the aquifer will run out at some point, unlike the water that's coming off the Colorado.
Tell us about this public official, the woman who I referenced in the. Tell us about her. I thought she was one of the more interesting, aside from you, of course, in the film. I thought she was one of the more interesting characters in the movie.
Yeah, and Holly's amazing, right? And so one of the things that we really set out to do when making this film is it's not an environmental film. I think, when you make a quote-unquote environmental film, you immediately lose half of Americans, right? Half of Americans are just going to tune out. Holly Irwin is supports President Trump. She's a conservative Republican in an area that has long fought against any sort of state regulation of their water. But Holly has seen what's happening in her community. She's seen as residents' wells continue to go dry, their pumps dry out. And these are folks that are oftentimes working class Americans. And so they can't afford to keep up and continue to drill as deep as the large agricultural endeavors. So you now have a coalition of Republicans that are asking for their version of water regulation. Right? And so we really made a film that tried to reach across what are just the political divides in America that can just stop conversations in their tracks. And so Holly Irwin has been described as like an Aaron Brockovich of rural Arizona, because since that original report came out about the amount of water that was being used by the big agricultural companies that had been coming into La Paz County, she has been nonstop fighting for this issue. She's aligned herself with Republicans. She's aligned herself with Democrats. She will say that water is not a political issue. It's just something that we need to solve. And in this regard, I think she finds a lot of fans.
So this is a perfect moment to ask you, with the 10 or so years you've been doing this and all the heavy, deep reporting you've done. So some type of water regulation seems to be smarter, more value added. So whether you're for regulation, opposed to regulation, tell us sort of, and I highlight for the audience, by the way, that if you come to this documentary assuming it's going to be a PowerPoint of solutions, it's not the film for you. It much more completely identifies, and in a compelling way, problems rather than solutions.
That's right.
And I think that there was a teeny piece at the end that I actually wish they hadn't even had at all, where they talked maybe if we had more regenerative agriculture. I was thinking, wait, you're telling me the world is coming to an end and now you give me this small beer solutions? Please don't do that to me. It's like, I wish those 90 seconds were not in the film. But let's talk about common sense pieces here. I'm obviously a big advocate for more technology in agriculture. Tell us some of the solutions that you see that would make sense, and what kinds of regulation make sense that doesn't stymie trade, that doesn't depress farm incomes, that doesn't exacerbate the divide in our country rather than give us all a better future. Talk about that.
Yeah. And I don't advocate for any particular solutions. Like, I view my role in a very traditional journalistic sense, where I just want to provide good information for which experts like are in this room and at this conference can begin to debate out with solid information how we should move forward, right? But I do think there are some things that are just unquestionably can be fixed without a whole lot of debate. And how you get there, of course, is going to take some. But one of them is like this, and I'll give you an anecdote. The U.S. government wanted to, how should I phrase this? Because I don't think it's public. The U.S. government wanted to target a high-value target, wanted to take out a high-value target in another country. And so they approached that other country and they said, we want to do this thing. And that country said, okay, but we want your help renegotiating a water treaty with our neighbor. And the U.S. government said, well, I don't know if we can do that, but considering that you have massive water loss in the conveyance of water through your country, we can help you get engineers, we can help provide funding, because there's just so much leakage in the system that before you try to go and renegotiate a boundary, a water issue with another country, let's just tackle some of the really easy, low-hanging fruit, which is reducing water waste in sort of these large infrastructure conveyance projects. And so I think that's just like right out of the gate. that seems like something that is a no-brainer, and then it's mostly around people debating on how much to
But
spend,
just to give some context to that,
Yeah.
even in the United States, our loss factor is about you had that in one of the slides. Our loss factor is about a third. There's a Chicago suburb, a significant sized suburb, that loses over 45% of its water every year because it's cheaper to let the Lake Michigan water just flow than it is to repair it. Jakarta, Indonesia, has a loss factor of 65%. Dublin, Western European city, has a loss factor routinely over 50%. So we're talking about monumental amounts of wasted water every single day, every single moment.
Yeah, and the film is focused on what happens if the problem is not fixed, and it doesn't. It's not theoretical. We're not saying in 15 years if blah 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 blah. We're showing what's happening today. What's already happened as a result of people viewing the coming scarcity. So we're showing how world leaders, how powerful interests, how mercenaries representing world leaders are going into developing countries to be able to grab up assets. When there are these more tangible solutions that, well, I think you're obviously arguing are much lower hanging fruit than hiring a mercenary to go into Zambia to try to buy up farmland, right?
Yes, you anticipated my next pivot. So I want to talk a little bit about the developing world. I think everyone says water is a local topic. Water contamination in Chicago is of no interest to people in North Carolina. Water contamination in North Carolina is of no interest to people in picking up the city. Doesn't matter. Water is very, very local in that regard, although water as a source of food, as a source of trade, is not local at all. The iPhones that we all have in our iPhones or Samsung phones that everyone has in their pocket is, I don't know how many months of showers it is, but it's months of showers to produce the water to produce this phone. And so, in a sense, global trade is trade in water as well, right? But let's talk about the developing world. If these restrictions are placed on China or on water asset management as a company that buys up lots of water rights, or hedge funds that buy up water rights both domestically and internationally, what does that do to poverty alleviation in countries? Since I'll ask Zambia, since those sections of the film were fabulous, by the way.
Thank you.
Really love those sections. I know you went there more than once.
On the question, you said restrictions. I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, if you start creating limitations on how companies can invest, what they can buy up, and so forth, along with those investments comes economic opportunity, local economic opportunity. Now, the question is it predatory economic opportunity that for a period of 5 years or 15 years, suddenly there's wealth being created, and then, no water's left, and see ya. I'll send you a postcard for my next venue. So to help us think through a little bit about poverty alleviation and the economic opportunity that this water trade brings as well. Is that clear? Is that, you understand?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And you use the word predatory. That's helpful too, because I think, look, poverty alleviation, the things you're talking to, this is like people are getting PhDs or have PhDs or have spent their entire careers answering these questions. What I'll do instead is tell you what I found on the ground so people can have a sense of some of the challenges that are going to get exposed by people like me, like investigative journalists that are going to go in and say, okay, you went and made that investment. I have now come in with cameras, and this is what I'm showing people your investment looks like. And so in Zambia, what we found was foreign investors had come in. They had gone through some amount of work to purchase the land, getting sign-off from some local authorities. But in Zambia, you've got federal, you've got provincial, and then you also have tribal. So you have a chiefdom. And they did not dot all of their I's and cross all of their T's. This has been adjudicated, so I can just say it. And they purchased land for a large farming operation to convert what had been, smallholder farms into, central pivot irrigation. And they found that people had been living there. And those people had been living there for over a century. I mean, it was their ancestral land. And rather than take a step back and say, okay, how do we deal with this? How they dealt with it was they brought out bulldozers and they bulldozed people's homes. They loaded them up onto flatbed trucks and they dumped them in a forest where there was no access to water or ability to grow their food. And then those people started to die from deprivation. So when that is what the foreign investment looks like, that, if you want to call it predatory, it can be your word, but I'm going to show up with cameras and I'm going to show people that that's what the foreign investment looks like, and then society can have a discussion if that's what they want their foreign investment and economic opportunities to look like. What I'll tell you from, as you know, because you've seen the film really looks at this through the lens of the DOD, the CIA, national security operatives, because what you end up with when you take people's ancestral land and their children begin to die, you create a population of people that are very angry because you have taken away their generational wealth, you've taken away their opportunity, and you've created a lot of pain in them seeing other people suffer, people that they care very deeply about. And so I'm sure all of you can imagine if somebody was doing that to your children, how long you might hold on to that grudge for. And so that's like what Brigg, the human rights attorney who's Zambian, who ultimately went to Georgetown Law and even now has a master's from Oxford and is just back there fighting for the people's rights.
He's like sort of the Nelson Mandela of the film.
Oh, I'll let you characterize it like that, but he is, in my years of reporting, I have met very few people as selfless and as committed as Brigg. Yeah, and that's what he says. People don't forget about their land being taken from them. And so from a national security standpoint, what the U.S. government is worried about, whether it's the depletion of Lake Chad and people losing their livelihoods for fishing, or just even losing access to fresh water, or it's these cases in Zambia, you radicalize populations, and those radicalized populations begin coming together, and then pretty soon you're sending in special forces, and you're calling them terrorists, but are they terrorists, or are they people that are fighting for their historic land grievances? And so you can debate that back and forth, but those are the realities, and this is why, and this is how your book starts. You talk about the national intelligence estimate that the NIC, led by the CIA, did in 2012 on water. And some of the backstory there is it was asked that NIE, a national intelligence estimate, is the highest work product that the U.S. intelligence community does. And somebody in the State Department asked the CIA to do that, and the CIA basically laughed at her and said, quote, "We work on real things here." And so she had to turn to the Secretary of State to demand that they do it, and when they did it, they came back and it was a full mea culpa. They recognized that water scarcity driving food scarcity was going to be one of the biggest threats to global stability going forward. And of course, you now see that much more frequently in global reports. You see it at the World Economic Forum and elsewhere. But that was the moment where the U.S. government really began pivoting towards the importance of these on an international level.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I still hope if folks in the audience have questions, we'll be able to reach out to them. But there's something that I found... sometimes it's like the thing that's not in the film that you find jarring also. So you have a couple of wonderful, it felt like you buy it from a news service, like congressional hearings. Senator Johans from Nebraska asked a question that it was integrated. I don't think it was your camera crew that was there. And there were a couple other clips like that. And I think, if I recall correctly, Secretary Blinken had a moment in the film. And again, did you guys try, and I have a purpose behind this question, did you guys try to sit down, have an in-office interview with, Secretary of Agriculture or with the Senate Agriculture Committee members to talk to them? And if so, what kind of reaction did they give you? And I'll give my opinion after you answer what happened.
So not the Secretary of Agriculture, no, but
because you know what I'm saying is that there wasn't a lot of on-camera interviews with people who are policymakers who really we elect them to affect this policy. And I've
interviewed those folks in the past.
And where are they?
Yeah, I've interviewed those folks in the past, and they've been in my other reporting. But as you know, this film is told through a lens. The director, Gabriella Copperthwaite, who directed Blackfish, and then she went on to do a bunch of scripted stuff with Dakota Johnson and Casey Affleck and Jason Siegel. She was just doing Hollywood films. This was her first foray back into a feature-length doc. She, from the get-go, said, how do we get people to sit in the seats for 90 minutes and watch a film essentially about water, virtual water and food. And she said, I'm going to make it an international thriller, right? That's how I'm going to do it. And you're going to take people around the world and connect all of these disparate things into one narrative. And sometimes when people hear politicians talk, especially in a very politically gridlocked country, they tune out. And so, you know, what we're giving people is information, and certainly what we need is people to legislate based on that information that I know people like Manu know, that I know you know, that people in this room know. And it definitely needs to be debated out because you need the farmers in the room. My parents were both the first to go to college. My dad was born on a hog farm in Iowa. You know, I come from agricultural stock. I went to the University of Minnesota. I know that farming. Yeah, Christina. And I know that farming is really hard, and that whether you're a farm manager or you're a farmer, you're putting in really long days with a lot of uncertainty. And so you need those stakeholders in the room while you're also working with the people that say we don't want radicalized Zambians, you know, and you're pulling, and the capital that wants ROI, right? So how do you pull all of those people? That is obviously a big hurdle that a lot of people in this room face, but I want the general population to know what it looks like when they don't solve it.
So I have had an interesting experience with elected officials. I happen to, because of another thing that I do with my life, I know a lot of senators and congressmen, Democrats and Republicans both. And what amazes me is, except for a couple of senators and congressmen from states that are very dry states, you would think that they would be aware of, you would think they'd be aware of water issues because it's an important national issue.
Yeah.
But in fact, I defy all of us to find a senator or congressman who can speak fluidly about water problems in America. Martin Heinrich from New Mexico is a former state water commissioner. Okay, so exclude him. But when this 2012 CIA report came out that you just referenced, talking about water as a global threat, I have a friend who's a senator on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So a CIA report, pretty important report.
Yeah.
So I called him the weekend that it came out. We were schmoozing about our families, about this and that. And I said, hey, I won't say his name because I don't embarrass him. I said, hey, Joe, what about this CIA report that just came out about water? What do you mean? He had no idea. I said, well, how often, I know it's classified, but how often does your committee talk about water risk and water issues around the world? He said it has never come up while he has been in the Senate. So something that's very frightening to me, and that I hope that a film like this will serve as a catalyst to get more dialogue about water issues, and that it will rise up to our political class so that they can jump in as well and start creating solutions, whether it's Holly in Arizona or whether it's presidential candidates or otherwise, that it could work out very well.
Seth, I don't know if it's ironic or fitting, but I think we need to get you some water.
Yes, but these glasses look like they were used by the last set of speakers. So I'm, in this era of almost COVID, I'm sort of like nervous about.
That makes sense.
I could drink. I was thinking the same. Maybe I could just pick up this thing and just chug it back. I don't know. Okay. Are there any questions for anyone in the audience before we call it a day and thank everybody for their attention? There is a question. Yes, please.
So do I ever worry for my safety when I do these documentaries? My short answer, my medium length answer, is that I'm a backcountry snowboarder, and that part of backcountry snowboarding is that I've done avalanche training, right, to identify and mitigate, but you never remove the risk of being swept up in an avalanche. You just manage the risk. And I think, like anything, I manage the risk as best that I can. I will say that the folks that are living in the communities, like in Zambia or like this attorney brig, Siechetema, they're living at a much higher risk level. There's a lot of people living with a much higher risk profile, and so I'm not that concerned about talking about my risk profile, and I just try to manage it as best I can. Say it again. Well, I mean, you know, I've gone into places, whether it was Caracas during the food riots, when really people were working all day and then starving or eating, you know, out of dumpsters. And, you know, we're talking about one of the major reasons why there's such mass migration out of Venezuela isn't because people hate Maduro. It's because they couldn't eat. They had jobs and they still couldn't eat. You know, and that's I love this line in your book that says, water scarcity is a proxy for government mismanagement.
Yeah.
And so I would say that Venezuela is a country like this, right? This is a country that has water. It's a country that has land, right? Like they shouldn't have massive, but they do have massive food scarcity. And so people were fleeing the country. And so do I worry about my sources? When I leave that country, people that I left behind are going hungry. Right? And now what are they going to do? Are they going to go to Colombia? Are they going to try to get all the way to the US? And these are just day-to-day people that I see, and they're just good people. And I just leave them behind and go back to San Francisco, where I can turn on tap water that I can drink, and I can have a hot shower, and I can go to the grocery store and buy food. You know, you live with that as a human, just saying these people have done nothing wrong and they're being left behind and treated like this, and this is their current situation. So, you know, that's one of the things that you live with regards to sources.
But by the way, Nate's reference to something that I think it was in my book, Let There Be Water, about water problems being a proxy for bad governance, it's an almost, except for maybe a tsunami, there is no other water event that doesn't come at you very, very slowly. Whether it's water depletion from aquifers in Arizona, whether it's food problems from bad water management, whatever the it is, almost every single water problem that I've tracked comes at us slowly enough that with focus by people like us here today, by media, by academia, by industry, by government, both multilateral institutions and national institutions, that water problems can't be addressed and headed off completely. And that, to my mind, is the saddest part of where you see water problems, which is the only reason they're not addressed in time is because folks have made the decision not to focus on it. I mentioned earlier that in the U.S. about a third of our water mains, we lose about a third of our water to bad water mains over the country. Could you imagine tomorrow driving wherever you come from, and every third tree had been downed, or going to your local park and every third bench had been broken, or going to your kid's school and every third desk was broken, or every third blackboard was broken? You couldn't even imagine that. There's no way that the public would, in a democracy, would ever put up with that. But we allow water to be degraded, and again, the science people have done a great job trying to fix that all over this country, and many of you here as well. But we allow water to be degraded in quality and future and an outcome, and put ourselves into a position of possible scarcity because of the fact that we have not demanded more of our leadership to fix these problems. I think this really, most of the times I think things are bottom-up solutions, but with water, because it's large budgets, it's large infrastructure, it's large lead times, it really has to be top-down, but we have to demand that of them. I track in my second book, Troubled Water, that every single time in American history, there's been a major upgrade of water quality or of water infrastructure. Every single time, it's followed a water crisis that has led mostly housewives to demand better for their children and their families, that percolated over to, no, I didn't mean that was a joke, but that migrated over to elected officials, and then they then acted with new legislation. Nearly every single time that's happened in American history. So we all have a role to play, and we can make money from water, we can have careers in water, but we also can use our suasion to ask more of our elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. Alex, is there more questions? Okay.
Do you want to make a comment or observation about the Ogallala Aquifer, which is pretty large, covers a number of states, as you well know?
You can, but I'd love to.
Go for it. Yeah.
So I spent about 8 months working on a book about the Ogallala Aquifer. I ended up not writing it because I concluded that there weren't enough people who'd care, so I didn't want to invest another whole year in the subject. So I actually know a lot about the Ogallala. Ogallala Aquifer is it's the largest aquifer in the United States. It covers many, many states in the High Plains. It goes all the way from the northern High Plains all the way down to the north of Texas. It's a monumentally large aquifer. It was created thousands and thousands of years ago. It got filled by approximately 14,000 years of accumulated rain and melted snow. And around the 1920s or so, as pumps started being used in agriculture, the Ogallala started being depleted. With your comment before about just because there's more efficiency doesn't mean there's water saved. Frequently, there's actually water lost because there's more water used. With these great new pumps, they started pumping ever more water out of the Ogallala to cultivate ever greater acreage throughout the entire region. By World War II, they invented super pumpers, mostly to save battleships that had been perforated by torpedoes and otherwise to save them. And those pumps came back to the United States. By 1965, about a third of the totality of the Ogallala aquifer had been pumped out, of an aquifer that took 14,000 years to fill. By the year 2010, another third of the aquifer had been pumped out. So now there are large portions, or significant portions, I don't want to say large, but significant portions of the Ogallala that now have gone dry, and where it's not possible to farm anymore. This is all groundwater, not surface water. And it's going to have an effect. Now, some states do better jobs of regulating the Ogallala than others. Nebraska, I think, is a model of regulation, and they use it very intelligently. They have smart regulation and smart assistance for farmers to help them, but other states are less active in creating opportunities. The Ogallala, if the Ogallala fails, which won't happen anytime very soon, but as I said 5 minutes ago, water problems come at you slowly. If the Ogallala fails, it's going to have catastrophic impacts, not only on the livelihood of millions of Americans in the High Plains, but it's also going to have catastrophic impact on the world because it is the breadbasket for soy, for corn, for wheat, for livestock feed. It is the breadbasket, so to speak, of much of the world. It's incomprehensible the damage that will happen if the Ogallala, for some reason, ultimately fails. I could say more. But
Alex, do we got time for one more? That woman up there had a question. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. So my question is, Pinal County farmers were selling that same wheat that they sold to the Saudi company to lots of cattle farms in Texas, other places. Lots of Canadian and Australian mining companies operate in Arizona. So what makes the Saudi situation unique?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and then I'll add to what you just said, that they're not the only ones. What makes it unique, and the reason I focused on the Saudis, was because it was a desert nation that had depleted its aquifers, and we're now creating this domino effect of having to go to other places. And so it wasn't to say, again, that this idea of bad actors, it wasn't to say that. It was to say this country was the world's 6th largest exporter of wheat in the 1990s. They depleted their aquifer, which doesn't get recharged like the Ogallala, because it was a fossil aquifer. And now they're in another region of the world that's a fossil aquifer. And so you begin to see the domino effect, and you see how these issues begin to cascade, right? Because now what happens when La Paz County aquifers go dry, then you go somewhere else and, becomes inhospitable or maybe even uninhabitable. To your point, and this is in the film, and then I done this in follow-up. In the film, I don't want to ruin anything for you all, but I'm just going to say it. In the film, Holly Irwin, who is fighting tooth and nail to stop this from happening, I hand her pension fund, which is invested in another nearby farm. That her own retirement money is actually funding the thing that she's trying to stop with an American company that has leased the land to UAE. And then in that case, the hay is still getting shipped elsewhere. But to your point, what does it matter where it's going? The issue is that these areas conceivably, according to the state, will run out of water, and not in a very long time horizon.
By the way,
does that answer the question?
At the Arizona Republic, actually, so on the environment desk, yeah. So I would love to chat after this.
Cool. You guys did great coverage around this in 2016. You guys got nominated for a Pulitzer looking at the groundwater.
Yeah, I wasn't there, but yeah, Ian James also wrote a story on.
And he's at the LA Times now.
He's at the LA Times.
Yeah,
it's great.
And Joanna Allhans, by the way, at the Arizona Republic, is one of the best water writers out there. She talks about important stuff all the time.
She's opinion.
I want to add a word or two about this, since you mentioned the Saudi wheat program. The origins, I mean, is impossibly crazy as it sounds to grow wheat in the desert, Saudi Arabia. Their initial impulse was that what happens if we get cut off because of our activities because of embargoes or sanctions against us, and we can't get food imported for our kingdom. So the original thought was, okay, we'll grow enough wheat for our own people, and we have this, it's called the D-I-S-I, the DC aquifer, which borders the Jordanian-Saudi border, and we'll grow wheat for our own people. But then what happened was they didn't have that problem because everybody was happy to sell to the Saudis. So they started stockpiling the wheat, and then, we're sitting on all this wheat. So we might as well sell this wheat. Now, simultaneously with this, and I'll just close with this statistic, which is impossible hardly to imagine, about 20% of the daily oil that is pumped in Saudi Arabia, which is the second largest or third largest source of oil in the world, about 20% of the oil that is pumped every day is used to desalinate seawater for the Saudi public. So the environmental harm, the deferred billions and billions of dollars that is being spent is just, Saudi Arabia is worthy of its own study to just see all the different ways in which we could be thinking about water smarter and differently. It's a bunch of crazy decisions made when you have a very, very rich kingdom and a very, very few decision makers who have a chance to have a democratic society have part of that conversation. Where I said before, we need to have smarter approach and more involved leadership talking about water. In Saudi Arabia, I would say the leadership was involved, but they made a series of probably pretty foolish choices about their water. There was another question, Alex?
I had another question, but I can ask after. Oh, okay. I was wondering Seth, if you could speak a little bit about Israeli water technology being used in the U.S. I know Netafim.
Sure. I'm happy to do it. I'll do it very, very briefly, though. I'll do it very, very briefly because I don't want to go off topic or what we're talking about here. But for a whole bunch of reasons, Israel was founded as a state in May of 1948. But they had a sense that they were going to have a state as much as 25, 30 years earlier. And they began creating all kinds of state-like institutions, universities, healthcare, education, highways, highway paving, and so forth. But one of the things that they understood was that the Zionist ideology, the dream that they would have the ingathering of Jews from all over the world and that there would be a natural population rise, is that would be stymied by a lack of adequate water. So similar to what your thesis is. And so they began thinking about and spending money on and planning for what they could be doing to improve the water quality and the water future of what they hoped would be their country. So by 1952, 4 years after they declare a state, even though they're bankrupt, they're gathering immigrants from the Holocaust and from Arab lands, Jews expelled from Arab lands and so forth, they begin working on a national parallel water infrastructure system to take all the water in the country, treat it, all the sewage, treat it to a high level, and then reuse it for agriculture. They start thinking about desalination, when it was purely a science fiction thought. Now we know it's a technology that works. But whether it's desalination or wastewater reuse or smart seed breeding, not NGO, not genetically modified, but smart breeding, thinking of all different ways that they could be saving water so that, for example, tomato plants, you don't need long roots, you don't need leaves. All that takes a lot of water to grow. All you need is the tomato. So they bred tomatoes types of tomatoes that the only part of it that really grows is tomatoes. They come without leaves, they come with short roots and so forth. So and then the technology kept growing and growing. And then somewhere around the 1980s, 1990s, all of a sudden, the country starts becoming a real force for their technology and trade around the world in water technology. And so whether it's drip irrigation or now this new irrigation I was talking about, this gravity-powered drip irrigation I was talking about earlier, or one of hundreds and hundreds of other innovations in water, whether it's water main leak detection, or whether it's policies in agriculture, or one of from every aspect of the water equation, there are Israeli water innovations that really have profound impact on the world's safety and well-being. And so that's a third of the book, Let There Be Water, and I'll stop right there. Well, now you don't have to read the book because I just gave it to you. But there's also all kinds of government incentives to make more of this happen, and it's become a major export industry for the Israelis. I think we're out of time.
So yeah, with that, thank you.
So thank you, everybody. And Nate, quick last question. And now what? Other than going to all the parties, getting the tuxedo, getting all the champagne, all that. But aside from that, what's the next project?
Yeah, I got to figure out what I dive deep into next, and so I'm kind of in that that stage of figuring out what to spend the next few years of my life on.
Okay, if anybody has ideas, please send them to me, and I'll partner with Nate. Okay, thanks a lot, and thank you, Alex, for inviting us.
Thank you. And so.